So what are hypotheses? In short, hypotheses are proposed explanations of phenomena, especially the term explanations of phenomena are highly important in this context. I quote, when certain things are used to explain what has been observed and so the truth of what has been supposed is impossible to demonstrate, one is making a hypothesis. Thus, philosophers frame hypotheses to explain the phenomenon. Therefore, I conclude hypotheses are explanations of phenomena. With the specific addition whose cause cannot be discovered either by experiment or by demonstration. This, of course, and this is why I use this introductory folio as an example, opens a lot of questions. What are phenomena? What means explanation in this context, as well what means experiment and demonstration, etc. But given this definition that hypotheses explain phenomena, then one might ask, can and should we ban hypotheses? With a reference, of course, to famous Newton's claim, I do not find hypotheses. And in this sense, Du Châtelet answers, and this is according to my opinion quite clear, that we should not ban hypotheses because hypotheses are an essential part of the art of scientific discovery. They have a heuristic function. So I quote, so making hypothesis is allowed, and it is even very useful in all cases when we cannot discover the true reason for a phenomenon and the attendant circumstances, neither a priori by means of truth that we already know, nor a posteriori with the help of experiments. I'm using here in Katherine Brading's translation, of course, we could go a lot into detail whether this English translation fits the French original and then compare the different French originals. But this is not the aim of my talk today. Again, we have here a lot of concepts which would need further discussion, interpretation, and explanation. For example, scientific discovery. I took it for granted that it means inventaire, also the famous Enlightenment term, which goes back, for example, to Leibniz. The art of invention means it's really the same as scientific discovery, or that hypotheses are useful to discover, for discovery, means it's the same as to say they have a heuristic function. But the most challenging questions concerning this quotation here, according to my opinion, is the connection between hypothesis and usefulness with true reason for a phenomenon and with the concepts of a priori and a posteriori, because they became a priori and a posteriori cornerstones of Enlightenment philosophy. And the crucial challenge is to understand what Du Châtelet means here concerning these both terms, a posteriori and a priori. then the next question. So if we agree and hypothesis shouldn't be banned from knowledge construction, then the next question is, how can hypothesis be confirmed to distinguish, in order to be able to distinguish between good and bad hypothesis? And here du Châtelet gives a very clear answer. Hypothesis can be confirmed via the method of falsification. One experiment is not enough for a hypothesis to be accepted, but a single one suffices to reject it when it is contrary to it. So a lot was written on du Châtelet's ideas of falsification, and contextualized until to Karl Raimund Popper's method of falsification. For me, the more interesting point of view here in my talk is to look a little bit more closely to the concept of moral certainty, because du Châtelet claims that by applying this method of falsification, we can at least achieve moral certainty. Hypotheses, then, are only probable propositions that have a greater or lesser degree of certainty, depending on whether they satisfy a more or less great number of circumstances attendant upon the phenomenon that one wants to explain by their means, and as a very great degree of probability gains our assent and has on us almost the same effect as certainty, hypotheses finally become truths when their probability increases to such a point that one can morally present them as a certainty. So this concept is quite unusual in the discussions on hypothesis in the 19th or 20th century. But in fact, the notion has a really long history, going back to the idea of different degrees of certainty, found, for example, in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, and also the Latin phrase moralis certitudo was quite a common phrase in the Middle Age to provide a basis for moral actions. And going back to the Aristotelian tradition of practical knowledge, avoiding the dangers of philosophical skepticism and opening the way for a benevolent casuistry, was the main motivation behind this term moralis certitudo, or moral certainty. But we shouldn't forget that the meaning of this term changed with the scientific revolution in the 17th century, largely because a paradigm shift from qualitative to quantitative thinking arose. Aristotle had understood science as the study of qualitative causes, and this idea became set in stone for a lot of years until with the scientific revolution in the 17th century with Galileo, Kepler, etc., the focus on quantitative thinking became a cornerstone of scientific methodology. And another
we only can see your first slide. I'm not sure whether this is on purpose, but I just wanted to
so this is my own interpretation of moral certainty, and this is indeed a kind of contextualization. I have no slides, I'm sorry. It's just to look a little bit more from my perspectives on moral
it's perfect.
certainty. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, just was for me, it's quite interesting to look here at the concept of moral certainty combined with hypotheses, and to trying to understand what du Châtelet means by moral certainty in this context. And what I wanted to say is that the focus and the combination between moral certainty and hypothesis becomes meaningful because of the idea of probability as a quantitative concept. And this becomes quite clear if you look, for example, at Jacob Bernoulli's writings. He introduced the idea of degrees of probability from 0 to 1. Bernoulli is often credited as one of the a founding father, so to say, of probability theory in the modern times. And it's interesting to see that Jacob Bernoulli, in this context, introducing the ideas of degrees of probability, uses also the term moral certainty. To quote, the idea of degrees of probability, I quote now, designate from total ignorance or uncertainty to firm conviction or moral certainty. So end of the quote. And again, this bridge, the chasm between the dualism between absolute doubt, like the skepticism proposed, and the dogmatic certainty of the scholastics. Yeah, in the 17th and 18th century, to conclude, moral certainty had became interchangeable with beyond a reasonable doubt. And this is interesting to combine moral certainty with the phrase beyond a reasonable doubt. And in this context, du Châtelet's claim that we can reach by framing hypothesis, via means of framing hypothesis, moral certainty becomes obvious and perfectly fits what we heard, by example, in Ruth Hagengruber's talk, how closely intertwined du Châtelet's concept of hypothesis is with reasoning. Now, another specific focus on my talk is the metaphor of a scaffolding. So du Châtelet, in her introduction of the Institution, compares hypothesis with the scaffolding of a building. One of the mistakes some philosophers, I quote, of our time make is to want to banish hypotheses from physics. They are necessary as the scaffolding of a house being built. It is true when the house is completely built, the scaffolding becomes useless, but it could not have been erected without it. All of astronomy, for example, is founded only on hypotheses, and if they had always been avoided in physics, it seems that fewer discoveries would have been made. So nothing is more likely to delay the progress of sciences than to want to banish hypotheses and to persuade oneself that one has found the great mainspring that moves all nature. Again, the metaphor of scaffolding and the comparison between scaffolding and hypothesis is not new at all. And it's an topos, quite common since the 17th century, and you can find it until the 20th century. I don't want to go into the discussion what a metaphor means in general, and how and whether we should avoid metaphors in scientific argumentation. This is another big topic. I just want to focus on the scaffolding metaphor and ask what it means in the context of Du Châtelet's considerations on hypotheses. For me, according to my opinion, it's quite clear that by using this metaphor, the idea of constructing and the idea that we are gain new knowledge by constructing theories of the world is obvious. Oh, I'm sorry. Interesting for me is also the comparison with building a house. So what means a house or a building in this context? So everyone knows what a house is, but is it justified to compare a house and the building of a house with a theory, theoretical construction, knowledge construction? Why? Because a house has a fundament, you need scaffoldings, and till the house is completely built, then scaffolding becomes, to quote again Du Châtelet, useless. But what it means compared to scientific knowledge construction. So concerning the concept of completeness. So here one might argue a house is built and then you no longer need a scaffolding. Scientific knowledge construction is an endless process. And it's repeated again and again with generations of generations. A house is built and then we can use this house without a scaffolding. But on the other hand, we can argue that human beings, if you just want to focus on the activity of human beings are always building houses. And it's not just one house we should focus on, but more on the building practice, the construction practice, the practice of building houses. And this is so old as humankind, and it's an endless process from generation to generation until the end of human beings, so to say. And in this, so reading from this perspective, the metaphor completely fits the idea of knowledge construction, and also questions the idea of completeness, the idea of absolute certainty, the idea of an omnipresent and omnipotent idea of God who knows everything. In this sense, we can read this metaphor also quite critically. And now the next step would be to compare how Du Châtelet uses this metaphor of a scaffolding with other famous, or not so famous, metaphors of the same kind. And of course, here, one of the famous quotation is Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's quote, "Hypotheses are the scaffolds which are erected in front of a building and removed when the building is completed. They are indispensable to the worker, but the worker must not mistake the scaffolding for the building." From an historical point of view, it's quite interesting to ask whether Goethe was well acquainted with Du Châtelet's Institution, whether this was an implicit reference to Du Châtelet's work. From a more methodological point of view, we might try to work out some differences and between this scaffolding metaphor with Du Châtelet's one. Here the worker is explicitly mentioned, but also differentiated from the scaffolding, from the building, and the idea again, if the building is completed, here again, the idea of completeness becomes quite obvious. Then the scaffolds became no longer indispensable, but again, it's an open question how we could interpret and understood this metaphor. Yeah, for me, it opens a lot of perspectives on looking at Du Châtelet's hypothesis chapter from new perspectives. I just want to go an outlook. What we might learn from the scaffolding metaphor, to summarize, we might discuss whether the scaffolding is a good comparison with framing hypothesis, and we might discuss whether the idea of building a house is the same as theory or knowledge construction from a meta-theoretical point of view. But again, if we are comparing different metaphors, we might also look what quotation becomes famous because of whether reason, because and asking why, and why other quotations were lost, so to say, in the history of philosophy and science. So Goethe's quotation, at least in the Anglophone and German world, became very famous compared to those quotations in Du Châtelet's Institution. This is the more astonishing because Goethe was, according to my opinion, in some cases, by no means so rational in his argumentation than Du Châtelet was. This is especially the case if we look how Goethe combined his reflection on reason and reasoning with sexism, we would say, from today's perspective. So just here in German, I'm sorry that I've not translated these quotations. In Goethe, we find a lot of such discriminating remarks. For example, vernünftig denken, wenn es möglich ist, eine seltene Sache bei Männern und noch seltener bei Weibern. Verstand und Vernunft sind ein formelles Vermögen, das Herz liefert den Gehalt, den Stoff. Wenn man die Männer als Verstand und Vernunft ansehen kann, so sind sie Form, die Weiber als Herz und Stoff. Goethe is just an example here. What happens indeed in the late 19th and early 19th century was this highly problematic combination with reason as male-dominated, ability and intuition, or as it is here done, material matter, stuff, with as a female characteristic, and that the distinction, for example, between intuition and reason has nothing to do with distinction between, on the one hand, we have here man, and on the other hand, we have here a woman, was criticized a lot, going back to, for example, the 19th century in the women's rights movement, among other women philosophers who protested a lot against this comparison was Christine Led Franklin. But we know also that history is closely related to the history of this discussion to the mind-body problem, as we can read in this famous Londa Schiebinger books, The Mind Has No Sex. This is an implicit quotation going back to a quotation from so the Bar, a French Cartesian who fight for women's rights even in the 17th century, and claiming that the mind has no sex. But the context was another one. It was the Cartesian context of the distinction between res extensa and res cogitans. And here the theological background is obvious, because the mind was also associated at that time, and no longer in the 19th century, with God's mind, yeah, and with the highly problematic theological discussions on sex and gender in this context. I would want to go into detail, but we might ask from our perspectives how we are doing history and philosophy, and how we should do that. And in this sense, okay, you cannot see it exactly, I'm so sorry. Oh, what a pity. So I'm just reducing my slides, then everyone can see here it. We can use, for example, Brooks Nigram viewer to analyze statistical quotations, to analyze concept, to analyze a statistical use of names. And just for quick, I decided to compare the discussion on hypothesis compared to Newton and to the Châtelet. From the beginning on, from du Châtelet's birth, when Newtonian mechanics becomes quite important in the European countries and cultures, compared it with du Châtelet. And from a first and very superfluous point of view, it's obvious that Newton was much more quoted than Du Châtelet was, and that the discussion on hypotheses played a much crucial role in the Newtonian context and in the Du Châtelet context. But as you all know, the use of such statistic tools is highly problematic if you use it uncritically. So Google Statistics is based on the Anglophone world. It uses as a data background Google Books, and in this context, of course, Newton is much more quoted than Du Châtelet, because Du Châtelet has to be situated in the French-speaking context. What would happen if we compare it just to focus on the French-speaking context? And here, again, the problematic is that the timeline is really long. So what happens if you just choose a very specific timeline, for example, between the first publication of the Institution until the death of Du Châtelet, or what happens if we choose another timeline slot, just focus on the 20th century, etc., etc. But what I'm just wanted to make clear with this kind how we might do history of philosophy is another point. That the way using such statistics make clear that the way of doing history of philosophy in earlier times was not rational in the sense of moral responsible as it should be. We all know the problem of the discrimination of women's names in the history of philosophy. We all know the problematic of building canonizations in the history of philosophy, with the consequence of neglecting women's contribution, but also neglecting minorities' contribution. We all know that power structures determine and dominate such buildings of canonization in the history of philosophy. And the really big challenge is how we can overcome this history of making memory to make the history of philosophy more equal, more diverse, more open, and more fair. But this would also mean to more objective. And with these challenges, I'm at the end of my talk, and thank you very much for listening.